Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now, we have quite the show today. Not as chaotic as the past few weeks, but definitely interesting. We got some serious stuff. We got the Golan Heights, because that's, all good and fun. Israel stuff in general. Our great friends over at APAC decided to have their conference. We're going to go over a little bit about France, somewhat about Italy and the, Belt Road Initiative. We might touch on Brexit, depending on what I feel like, because it's just such a dumb topic at this point. I'm not even sure if I want to address it. But, of course, Ukraine, we're a week out from the election there. A little bit about Venezuela. Some stuff about Japan, which I didn't expect. And finishing off with North Korea. But let's get right into it. So, our good friends in Syria have had quite the time. So, tensions have continued to rise, specifically, of course, around Idlib. We've been talking about this for months at this point. So, a brief overview of some of the events of the past week are: militants have launched several munitions containing toxic substances at residential areas in the towns of Al-Rasif and Al-Azia, which reportedly killed 21 civilians. Not killed, but injured 21 civilians. I actually don't think there were any deaths. There's been more skirmishes between HTS and ISIS erupting in Binish. 2 civilians were killed by artillery strikes in Al-Qurqat. Pro-militant sources claim that 7 Syrian soldiers were killed in Mashari. Now, these are all just towns and suburbs outside of Idlib and in northwestern Syria in general, just to give you some perspective. And there's been a series of artillery exchanges that were in western Aleppo. So the SAA shelled militant positions in Jarjanas, I believe that's how you pronounce it, reportedly killing 10 HTS fighters, as well as destroying several of their positions and equipment belonging to them. 6 ISIS members committed suicide attacks when HTS forces attempted to capture them and banish. And SAA soldiers were reportedly killed in western Aleppo. And here's where it gets interesting. There's been YPG Kurdish shells attempting to assassinate the head of the FSA military police in Afrin. Sporadic clashes have erupted between pro-government forces and militants in western Hama, again in that northwestern part of Syria. Now, it appears, although tensions are rising, infighting amongst the various opposition groups has intensified. Now, they're more concerned about fighting each other than Assad's forces or pro-Assad forces or Iranian forces or even the limited amount of Russian forces in the country. This has been a common theme throughout the conflict since the beginning, but has seemed to intensify in the last few months, which is honestly a good sign for Assad, a good sign for the government, the fact that these groups are so destitute, so lost, that they are just turning on each other and eating each other. Now, the White House, interestingly enough, has also declared victory over ISIS for the 15th time since December. Now, of course, Pentagon officials later contradicted the White House. It was claimed on the 22nd of March that ISIS had been defeated in the Euphrates Valley. Now, I honestly could not care less either way, because they will find a way to justify U.S. troops staying in Syria until they absolutely cannot, for perpetuity. Until the American empire falls in on itself, we're going to have troops in Syria, and probably even a little bit after, if we're being honest. Now, I can guarantee you, when they can no longer renege on the claim that ISIS has been defeated, when ISIS is finally actually defeated, when they can no longer say, oh, but they popped up again, they will claim they must help the SDF or some other quote-unquote moderate rebel group or the Syrian people counter Iranian-backed forces and Iranian influence. And, again, when it comes to the SDF, they're de facto a Kurdish group. They're the Syrian Democratic Force. They're supposed to be a diversity coalition, but we all know they're just a rebranding of the YPG. What we have here is they've secured pretty much their own state in northern Syria for the time being. Iran isn't operating in northern Syria. Assad doesn't want to risk it, and I doubt the Russians would even get behind him if he did. So the SDF has no motive to, which means we're going to have to find more fighters, another moderate rebel group, to fight against the Iranian influence, because I doubt we're going to be able to convince the SDF to fight Hezbollah or whatever they want to try to do it. Now, the U.S. actually has yet to issue any official response or threats of retaliation due to the recent escalation in Idlib. As opposed to, you remember what Trump was like last September, it would be a mistake for Assad to go into Idlib. It would be a bloodbath. It would be a humanitarian disaster. All the projection around Idlib last exactly 6 months ago at this point. Now, this is a somewhat promising sign after months of disappointment. However, Trump also did find a way to disappoint, especially on the Syria issue, and he has recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. Yeah, I would definitely agree, and just bear with me a second. I got to change up mics. Things have been weird, so okay, how we're back with that, and yeah, your audio wasn't picking up as much as it should, but we should get that all sorted out, and it should be fine. But yeah, I definitely agree. It was meant to weaken resolve for Assad, but ultimately, this move doesn't change anything except the fact that Genie Energy can now exploit it. But I'll get more into that because I have no doubt, of course, as we just discussed, people have heard Trump's recent decision to recognize the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. Now, there's been a push for this in the U.S. government since, I believe it was August. Now, we've speculated in previous episodes that this would happen. I'm not surprised in the slightest. You had Lindsey Graham over there. You had a bunch of senators over there. I think even Ted Cruz, no surprise. Now, as we were saying, the territory has been pretty much Israeli since the 1967 war. Keep in mind that's the same war that Israel destroyed the U.S.'s liberty in, so, that's something. Now, the U.S. recognition of the annexation is speculated to allow, as I was saying, Genie Energy to begin exploiting oil in the Golan Heights. Now, the Russians have condemned this move by the U.S., but as we discussed previously, it's doubtful that the Russians will take any significant action against it, which is interesting because after the fall of Daraa and the rebel groups on the Israeli-Syrian border, actually it was Russian military police that took it upon themselves to guard that, so that's going to definitely be an interesting situation, but and it gets better with the whole thing because there's been quite a lot of victory laps, and as we'll get into, let me find my place in the notes because my computer apparently decided to have a stroke. But Netanyahu, in response to Trump's move, proclaimed that he had performed a Purim miracle. Now, Israeli politicians have been taking a victory lap, and now they're pushing to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank. The Zionists in the U.S., as I was saying, have been performing several victory laps of their own. My personal favorite one is Pompeo recently had an interview with the infamous evangelical Zionist Christian Broadcasting Network, and I quote, so CBN, Christian Broadcasting Network's Jerusalem Bureau Chief, Chris Mitchell asked the Secretary of State, could it be that President Trump right now has sort of been raised for such as time it is, just like Queen Esther, to help save the Jewish people from the Iranian menace? Smiling Pompeo, yeah.
Oh, it's so cringy. I mean, American evangelicals, dear God.
Yeah, but Pompeo's response is even better. He says, as a Christian, I certainly believe that's possible. It was remarkable. So we're down in the tunnels where we could be 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and if I have history just right, to see the remarkable history of the faith in this place and the work of our administration to make sure that this democracy in the Middle East, that the Jewish state remains.
Remember when Jesus was on the gave a Sermon on the Mount, and he talked about how good the American Constitution was and democracy? Like, that was really awesome.
Oh, absolutely! Like that was probably my favorite part, and it's just wonderful. And Israel is honestly, unequivocally our greatest ally, and I would love to sacrifice my nation's wealth and resource for them. But it gets better. It gets better because Hamas, the dreaded spooky Hamas that is just out to destroy Israel, and they would destroy them tomorrow if they had the capability, has launched rockets at Israel, which means I see the Iron Dome has really worked out for them. I'm glad we spent billions of dollars for it to do its job. Now, many were quick to say this was in retaliation for the moves in the Golan Heights, which makes absolutely no sense. I doubt a Muslim Brotherhood-backed group such as Hamas is supported of Assad's government or Syria in general. Now, Israel, of course, used this as an opportunity to launch another bombing campaign on Gaza. Now, in theory, Israel has the capability to destroy Hamas tomorrow, but would rather keep them around as a boogeyman and showing disregard for civilian life on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, the Israelis have to keep watch of the bottle rockets that are coming over into their side. I mean, the turnabouts always play out the exact same way, where there's extraordinary, almost unmitigated retaliation for essentially ineffectual bottle rockets that are launched into Israeli territory. But that's the state of the world that we live in. That's that's been going on for decades. So we have two very, very, possibly the most powerful countries and influential countries in the world.
Oh, absolutely. But those bottle rockets, they got them from Iran, so we got.
Oh yeah, that's right. Hamas and Iran. Oh my
god. Because there's definitely a direct supply line there. That I'm sure they can just sneak around into the Gaza, give them all those supplies and resources. Makes total sense.
Yeah. They met in Prague. Oh. Remember when Saddam Hussein was really behind 9/11 and he went to Prague?
Oh yeah, of course. It's dastardly. It's just dastardly. Now, on a side note, Pompeo is also threatening Israel over accepting Chinese investments. Now, I wouldn't read too much into this. It's likely just a floor show with Israel's participation in order to intimidate other countries that U.S. may make threats towards. So, for example, if another African or Asian nation is taking investment to Chinese and receives a condemnation from the U.S., they'll think, oh, it must be serious. They even told Israel to stop it. So I wouldn't read too much into that as much as I would like to, but not much is going to come of that.
Israel will do whatever it wants. It makes no difference. Pompeo can talk all he wants.
Yeah, and like I said, I doubt those words even mean anything with concerning the fact of statements we just read previously. Now, one thing I will mention on Israel and actually in relation to Syria, it's worth noting there's not been an Israeli strike on Syria since the 20th of January this year. It's been over 2 months. It's been almost 2 months and a week. Now, if I would assume this is because Netanyahu doesn't really want to rock the boat before the election. Now, if he loses, which I'm not sure at this point, I thought he was, but maybe this recent invigoration by Trump and the whole Golan Heights thing may breathe enough life into where he could barely squeak out a victory. But if he does lose, I expect a massive parting shot at Syria.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Yeah, it's just around the corner. I think him going, getting the U.S. to recognize the Golan Heights is partly there to bolster his electability. I think the so-called rocket attacks into Israel are also there for the same reason. I would expect an uptick in this as we approach the elections. I mean, he's just going to use fear, right, as a way to get as many backers as possible.
Oh yeah, I mean that's been Netanyahu's and honestly the Likud election strategy the whole time. It's like, we are the only ones who can keep you safe. You must vote for us. The Social Democrats won't keep you safe. The center-right parties won't keep you safe. Only the strong Likud party knows how to defend Israel, which, based on their military prowess in Syria, I would feel, if that's what you got, if that's your best option, I feel bad for you. Now, continue. Go on.
No.
Okay.
Now,
continuing on our greatest ally, the state of Israel, it's AIPAC week. AIPAC is in town. They're having their nice little conference that time of year again. Now, with many high-profile speakers, which are usually from both political parties, but this has been a bit interesting this year, especially with a lot of the fallout from the Ilhan Omar scandals. Now, it's interesting because two of the biggest speakers were, of course, Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo, the Vice President and Secretary of State. Now, both Pence and Pompeo carry on with the usual tripe, but they mixed it in with the lovely phrase, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Yes, of course. Anti-globalism is also anti-Semitism. Anti-elitism is also anti-Semitism. Anti-banking is corporate banking is anti-Semitism. It just never ends.
Oh, of course. Borders are anti-Semitic. Okay, listen to me. unless it's on Gaza. Okay, we can build a wall there. But trust me, it's anti-Semitic otherwise. Now, as I was saying, there's been an interesting rift this year. Several Democratic frontrunners are not attending the conference. Kamala Harris, who was one of the main speakers last year, is not here this year. One of the few prominent Democrats that actually did show up this year was, of course, none other than good old Chucky Schumer, and he's not running for president.
Yeah, of course, he's going to be there. I mean, it's an obligation, I would presume. I mean, he's been a hardcore AIPAC supporter his whole life.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
and of course, he has said wildly statements that are wildly at odds with one another on Israeli television and what he has said in the States. He has a concept of what Israel should be and what America should be that are very, very different from one another.
and we guarantee you it has nothing to do with his ethno-religious identity, and the fact that any one of you would even presume that makes you a bigot, and I ask that you stop watching this program right now.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally not.
just close out that browser window. But now, despite all this, American Jews are still voting overwhelmingly Democrat and have less and less affinity for the state of Israel every year. You look at the opinion polling; they care less about the state of Israel. They usually identify as, something as like a world citizen, or strangely enough, based on I guess could get in some things, they start to identify with the country they're living in. But yeah, amongst young American Jews who are usually very liberal, very on board with the whole neoliberal agenda, they're caring less and less about Israel.
Yeah, and in a sense, why would they? I think they still identify as being Jewish, and I just think for themselves, they see America as a better place to live, and not just in America, but all over the Anglosphere and in the West generally. So I tend to think that they have they choose America as their home. That may not be the case if America were different. They might then consider Israel, but that's not the case.
Yeah, that might not be the case when Trump's prediction with Bolsonaro comes to pan out in 30 years.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, they might leave then. But that is a concern. And liberal Jews as well are not reproducing at a very high rate at all. The projections as they stand now is that in the next 30 years, what you're going to see is an increase in a representation of Orthodox Jews in America, and that actually might, because they tend to be more conservative. They on social issues, they tend to overwhelmingly vote for Republicans by at least 80%, and so on. There's still a small sector right now, but that is the way the trend has been going also for quite some time. But what could happen in the next 20, 30 years? What kind of America are we going to have in 20, 30 years? It's going to be a vastly different America than we have now.
Yeah, I'm not feeling that's going to be for the better. It depends on your definition of better, but I think if you're tuning in this program, the future does not look bright for you. But I do want to move on just to briefly touch on this. Now, the Yellow Vests took to their street in the 19th week of protests. Now, the protests, there was a dip compared to previous weeks. France has beefed up their police, and they have even deployed some military units and gave them authority to open fire if the situation gets out of control. Now, some local governments have began to ban the protest altogether. Now, I'm not saying this is a reason to get discouraged, even though the violence may have subsided. There's still enough discontent amongst the French people. The fact that they're still in the streets 19 weeks in a row. Again, they tried to do this when there was the whole anti-Semitic hate crimes happening. I believe that was actually back in January, almost 3 months ago at this point. And they said, this is the end of the Yellow Vests. Every few weeks you'll get one of these stories where it's the end of the Yellow Vests because the turnout was lower, this particular week, or they did something or some hate crime happened. But again, I don't see a movement that's lasted. Again, next week will be, I believe, the 5-month mark. I don't see it just dissipating like that.
Yeah, I don't either. And also, some prominent leftists have already come out in France that have denounced Macron for bringing in the military. France 24 even went so far as to suggest, we've used them before in the past. Well, yeah, that was after a terrorist attack. Are you equating like what's happening with the protests on the same level as coordinated terrorist attacks like Bataclan? I don't, most don't see that as a fair equivalence. They don't see it as an equivalence, rather. The other is the amount of other cities where the Yellow Vests are protesting has also increased, despite it's decreased to some extent in Paris. Now, of course, over 7 people have lost their hands. Over 22 people have lost an eye or eyes. They're playing an intimidation game here. But from what I understand, a lot of people are very invested that he is routed out, including people who supported him in 2017 during the so-called Impossible campaign. So, I would suggest that the Yellow Vests aren't going away. And also that we shouldn't forget that in Belgium, there was also a protest and 400 arrests. They were protesting around the Brussels EU Parliament building. So that's something that's actually really, really ignored when we talk about Yellow Vests.
As we were saying, we actually talked about the story. They secured the resignation of the prime minister.
That's right. That's right. And so they have been going on contemporaneously as well. I felt that was an important thing to mention.
Granted, as we said with the original Yellow Vest protest, even though Macron's approval ratings are still in the gutter, even though he's still hanging on by the thread, you see with what happened in Belgium, a prime minister will resign if there's a downturn in the market. A president will hold on to power until they feasibly cannot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think Macron days he's lost legitimacy. I think. He of course there's not going to be a re-election at this point. It's just to save the semblance or the machinations of the institution of democracy at this point. That's all it is until they have another election cycle. But him as a candidate, it's absolutely over. I think they're afraid though that if he is ousted, that sets a dangerous precedent for France. That in itself marks a kind of the beginning of a period of a new kind of destabilization. I think that's what they're worried about the most. But the situation does seem to be escalating. I think he isn't going to win anyone over by bringing in the military.
Oh, absolutely not. And this is the same military that you had, talks of back in November, December, saying he has betrayed this country, and we don't know if we can stand behind him anymore. There were murmurs of that. Now, I don't know how legitimate those were, that was a fake story. But again, if that's the same military saying that, I doubt when push comes to shove, they're going to stand by him.
That's right. And also, the average wage in France is actually pretty low. It's about 23,000 with a government program, a social net program. There's still a very high rate of unemployment in comparison to, say, the U.S. or Canada. So I don't see the protests dying down as long as there are these profound economic problems.
I mean, yeah, they may take different forms, like they may ditch the whole Yellow Vest uniform thing they've been doing, but protest and discontent aren't going to stop.
That's right.
But yeah, I definitely thought that was interesting in the fact that neoliberalism, again, it's easy to get blackpilled. I admit I am somewhat myself, especially about the state of my own nation. But neoliberalism as a whole, it's crumbling. It's losing its grip. It's not feasible anymore. And we're seeing this. I say France is, you could almost say, ground zero in the West for that. I know you have Hungary. I know you have Italy. But those are countries that, again, you don't think of as the same as France. As you were saying, French wages are actually lower than you'd expect them to be. It's just mainly because we think of urban areas, such as Paris. That's where we get our ideas of France. And, again, you get some of the rural areas, it's more comparable to a Southern or Eastern Europe.
Yes, that's right.
Now, speaking of Southern Europe, we have a little bit of news about Italy, a bit of a follow-up story. On Friday, Italy finally put pen to paper on the Belt Road Initiative. Now, that's the Chinese investment program. That's where they want to build the new Silk Road, which is, it's a bit strange, that's, I guess all roads really do lead to Rome, but, that's beside the point. Now, this was spearheaded by Luigi Di Maio, who is one of the two deputy prime ministers along with Salvini, and he represents the Five Star Movement, which is the broad, just anti-establishment, anti-European Union party. And that's both right and left wing. We went over this actually a while ago, but this move was not supported by Salvini or Lega, or the League, if you will. I am, however, much less concerned about a European country taking Chinese investments as opposed to a country in Africa or Southeast Asia. Italy has much more leverage in these countries, and it can also appeal to the U.S. or Russia if worse comes to worse. And with Lega's influence, I doubt the Italians will fall into a debt trap, and I imagine they can make a more comparable agreement than, for example, what's one of the countries that, for example, what an Ethiopia or Indonesia would.
Well, let's not forget Marco Polo went there first.
Let us not forget.
I couldn't resist, but I agree with you. They have a lot more say in the finer details of how this is going to be implemented. I think of it as actually quite a positive development, because the truth is, no one else is doing it, and I think Russia attempted something like this a few years ago, and of course that got the cackles of the EU and America up. So I think China, doing this gives also Italy a certain amount of leverage. What are their options? Who else is going to initiate this without strings attached? I mean, China is not interested in Italy changing its culture and changing its immigration quotas. It's not interested in any of that. It's just business.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I rag on the Chinese, one thing I really respect about them and their foreign policy is they don't care what you do, what you believe in. If you're willing to make a deal, let's make a deal.
Yeah, exactly, and to the exact same extent, one can say the same thing about Russia. They don't expect you to become a de facto different country just because you're doing business with them. That's countries that do are basically saying, we determine you. Your future belongs with us, and those are the dictates of the EU, and those are the dictates of the US.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying, I mean, Russia is a country that will do business with Germany one day, go to Iran and Russia the next, and is in Italy the next week.
Right, and this also, of course, ties in with what you were saying about that neoliberalism is slowly crumbling, right? Because neoliberalism has to also be understood with capitalism. And there's a particular kind of capitalism that's evolved around neoliberalism, and you don't see that more clearly than when you have, say, EU loans, because EU loans aren't just loans; they're also cultural pacts. So that is what I see as a positive development, that loans can be had. A country can, improve, its business, its infrastructure, what have you, create jobs and so on. And there's no ideological tie-in. It can determine what its ideology is.
Yes, and honestly, Italy almost reminds me of Turkey in the sense that it's in an area where pretty much every world power is vying to be. It's in that very pretty much the very center of the Mediterranean. So if one power is giving them trouble, if the U.S. is giving them trouble, if China is giving them trouble, if Russia is giving them trouble, they can appeal to the other two in order to put pressure on them. So again, they're in that unique position where they pretty much have leverage over all the world powers at once, despite being, I get, barely a secondary power.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, barely that, I would say. I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely consider Turkey more of a secondary power than I would the Italians. But as we've been saying, this should come as no surprise at all. The U.S. has shown itself to be friends of populists and nationalists in rhetoric only. Their actions do not inspire confidence among the populists and nationalists in Europe.
Yeah.
Now, I hazard to even touch on this because it's so hard to even find news about it because it just fluctuates so much within, again, I could write these notes 3 hours before the show. In 5 minutes, something else changes. But Brexit, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if they're getting out or not. I heard some people saying, oh, they found a way they can get out in 2 weeks. I heard some people saying they're not getting out until June, which would make it over 3 years. Because, of course, we're coming up on that, March 29th deadline, which has been pretty much delayed. People have been going on with Theresa May's deal. And, again, it's just a shit show that I'm just briefly touching on because there's so much contradictory information out there. To the point where you would think you would find this kind of news about a third world country or war zone, but no, this is supposedly a first world country.
Right, and I think a lot of Brexiters, of course, I think the whole thing is soured, and it's not just because the technicalities of the agreement, the lack of an agreement, issues with Northern Ireland, but the growing sense that even leaving the EU wouldn't fundamentally change concerns such as immigration and migration. That culturally as well, the country is determined to go into, continue on a neoliberal trend. So what does being outside of the EU exactly grant Brexiters?
Oh,
I think that's the major black pill. I think that's why there's a feeling of anxiousness, discontent, and just generally black pill about the whole thing. Because I think Brexit, I think for lots of people, in very much the same way with Trump, that there was a feeling that lots of things would change. Culturally, things would change, but it didn't. It created a conflict, and it just made our opponents more resolute.
Yeah,
I'm not saying long term that it isn't. I'm not saying long term that these things don't have an effect, and that one should give up. Far from it, but. That's what I see at the moment, that Brexiters might lose the will to push for it because it doesn't seem, apart from a few critical issues, it doesn't seem that the Britain they want is coming back.
I would absolutely agree to the point where, it's like we could have migrants from Africa and the Middle East under the European Union, or we can get out of the European Union and bring in immigrants from Pakistan and India because that's so much more of an improvement.
Right. So there's some details. I mean, of course, there's also the question of the currency and so on, but I don't see the fundamental changes that I think Brexiters initially had hoped for.
Yeah, and the biggest disappointment about Brexit isn't even about the UK itself. It's the fact that it is pretty much shown the price of dissent in the European Union. It is shown, this is what happens when you try to leave. This is what happens when you try to go against us. Now, amongst some countries, that may have an effect, like, we better fall in line. But I think amongst other countries, such as more the countries going in populist direction now, it may invigorate them, saying, that's what they do when you go against them, so what reason do we have to listen to them? It may inspire someone like Orban to go even harder at the European Union. Granted, Orban didn't burn bridges with Russia, unlike, our friends over in London.
Right, and Russia has been amazingly patient with Orban, because of course Orban also, at the outbreak of the war in eastern Ukraine, I mean, he was sending old tanks to supply the Ukrainian army and so on, and Putin has played this very well too. But Orban, I think, has recognized that he's going to need Russian partnership, and so a long game has to be played, because there's some, of course, there's very significant changes that are happening in the EU now.
Yeah. So let's move on to a much more, I guess, say, fun subject, and that is the election in Ukraine. We're less than a week out from it. On Sunday, the first round of Ukrainian elections will begin, where, we're down from 44 to 39 candidates on the ballot. Now, of course, as we were discussing, there are only three, I guess, say, two viable candidates. Those are Zelensky, Poroshenko, and Timoshenko. Poroshenko, as we were discussing, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, has been disgraced and has become a laughingstock. Timoshenko, as we said before, is the preferred candidate of the U.S. and European Union. Zelensky is the populist choice. However, I speculate that within these coming days, his campaign will be derailed. Now, one thing I didn't consider, I thought he was in the safe zone. I figured if they were going to do something, they would have done it already. maybe they're waiting to get into that round 2 of elections, because it's most likely that Zelensky is moving on to the second round of elections, and most likely he'll be facing off against Timoshenko. Maybe that the establishment, the European Union, the U.S., is waiting to pull something after March 31st, before the second round of elections. That's where my mind's at right now, that something's probably going to happen to him after he wins the first round.
I think it's an excellent deduction. The first round will let happen, and then I would then suppose that there would be a crisis. Zelensky seems to have walked back on some of his statements. He's promising he has a legal way to bring back Eastern Ukraine and Crimea. Timoshenko says she does too, but she won't divulge how. Of course, Poroshenko has the same approach that he's been using for the last 4 or 5 years. And he's also promising a quick entry into the EU and NATO.
You were watching that South Front video, weren't you?
Pardon me?
You were watching the South Front video, weren't you?
Well, yeah. Is that a bad thing?
No, absolutely not. I watched today, too.
Yeah, so now, I mean, there's other candidates promising gas at half the price and free Wi-Fi, and right now, there's just basically a huge migration of Ukrainians leaving Ukraine. They're moving to Poland because there was already a huge migration of Poles leaving Poland to go to Western Europe.
Yeah, the ones that hate Russia go to Poland. The ones that don't hate Russia just go to Russia.
Basically, essentially, that's it. Now, I mean, they're fairly well integrated and so on, but apart from cheap labor, I don't see any kind of development that's occurring right now in Ukraine that would suggest that they're going to have a quick entry into NATO or the EU. Honestly, they look worse for wear than Georgia in that regard. So,
oh no, it's something that was supposed to be just a quick and easy, U.S.-EU coup turned into such a nightmare just because Russia had troops stationed in Crimea. It's almost comical in a sense.
Right. I mean, I've heard people argue that they can still join NATO without Crimea.
No, they're worthless to NATO without Crimea. That was the entire point of all of this.
I know. This is exactly it, right? But I think some of them are just so enraged that it's a temporary measure.
Yeah, I mean, like I've been predicting this since the beginning, that there will be the crawl back to Russia. I don't know when it's going to be. I don't know how it's going to play out. I thought we were seeing the key things with Zelensky, but he has walked it back some. Probably for political reasons, but again, he's probably still the best bet that that poor country has right now. But there will be the crawling back to Russia because, after they lost Crimea, they've lost all value to the U.S. and EU to the point where you get some aid, we'll give you some weapons, we won't give you any significant aid, and pretty much you're worthless to us without it. I know you have some agricultural stuff, but we don't care because we just want to be on Russia's doorstep. Now, that's pretty much how it's played out, and on top of the prelude to the election, there's been calls for the U.S. ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch, to be removed from her post. Now, she was actually appointed in 2016 under Obama and has allegedly tried to undermine Trump in Ukraine, which is no surprise. Now, Trump has allegedly tried to have her removed since he came to office. She's been pretty much, again, the perfect neoliberal stooge, the perfect person Obama would want to leave behind for the agenda he pursued for 8 years. Right there, agitating against Russia, agitating for neoliberalism. And apparently calls for Yovanovitch's resignation date back to May 18 from members of Congress writing letters to Pompeo calling on her to get rid of her.
I haven't followed on about her. So I don't know what to say about it. I don't know how much it matters at this point.
I mean, if you want a brief description, pretty much a dumber Victoria Nuland. So I don't know how you accomplish that, but that's pretty much what she is.
I mean, I wonder how much the West can really invest into Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has proven that that it's difficult to invest in it, but and also like you say, the West. How much are they going to invest? They're not willing to go to war for Crimea. They're not willing to, or they're unable to develop Ukraine to the point that it would even attract Russians, right? So that you get some kind of envy developing the way that we saw during the Cold War. So there's no argument for why people would want to remain in Ukraine. So it's become like if you exclude Russia as a European country, I mean, Ukraine is literally the biggest European country, and it's just a wedge basically against Russia. And it's not even all that effective because it just wastes all its resources in eastern Ukraine, which it still hasn't been able to defeat these the small band of like Eastern Ukrainians who just managed to just weather the whole thing out.
I mean, this is like Nazgul decided to start taking themselves seriously and took up arms. That's what the rebels in Eastern Ukraine are.
They are Nazgul, though.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I do not deny that one bit.
They're Nazgul, they're Christbull, they're like this strange mix of like Christian Orthodoxy, classic Stalinist communism and so on, and like just a whole bunch of other factions. But like, I mean, they're not all just Russian recruits going there. These people really believe it. I mean, it's who knows what kind of role that they're going what kind of role they're going to have later on in Russia, historically speaking, because this often happens where you have areas that demonstrate a kind of heroism, and the heroism is innately tied to a kind of particular ideology that they want. Because like you could argue that why not just give up that territory and assimilate into Russia or go to Crimea? Like why keep fighting? The answer isn't just because Russia supplies them with weapons. You need more than that. You need like a will to persist. And amazingly enough, 5 years later, they're still fighting.
Yeah, I mean, and it's actually kind of funny. I just want to mention on a side note, I saw a picture, like, it was from an interview, like, screen capped with the subtitles and everything, and the guy was wearing one of the old communist military uniforms, had a Soviet flag behind him and everything, and he's like, and the interviewer asked him, what are you fighting for? And he's saying, I'm fighting against the neo-Nazis and their Western capitalist Jewish Masonic backers.
Oh my God. That's literally like post World War II Stalin right there. Oh my gosh, I know. And the irony, like you'll see these like armored vehicles, and they'll have like the Christ's head, the old sort of medieval flag, and they'll have like a communist flag. But that is to them, that's like Westerners don't get it, but for them it means something else. They associate it with like, we didn't become a German stooge. We didn't, Hitler, didn't kill us and move Germans into that area, and and so on and so on. So they have a very different take on it. In our perspective, probably won't make sense to them, and their perspective doesn't make sense to us, and so on.
Well, I actually remember like early on, a lot of the people in Eastern Ukraine fighting against the Ukrainian government, the various backed militias, a lot of them were actually veterans from the Soviet war in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and also some of them participated in Serbia as well, and Georgia.
But not to get off too much of a tangent, pretty much, yeah, Ukraine's situation embodies why it's called Ukraine. It's the borderland. It was always meant to be the borderland of Russia, and unless it completely sacrifices its identity to the West, that's all it ever can be.
Yeah, possibly, unless it changes its name, or Ukraine has a different connotation.
Like I said, I'm surprised they don't call themselves Ruthenians.
Yeah, yeah, but that's just Western Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
Andy Warhol was a Ruthenian, by the way. I don't. Most people don't know
I
that.
did not know that until now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do like. I mean, from experience, friends, Russian friends that I have, they would like to see this heal. Like, they would like to see a resolve to this. They honestly want to get, want to have the kind of brotherly association that they had with the Ukrainians. Having friends in Moscow myself, it's hard to find a Muscovite that doesn't have like at least one grandparent that's not Ukrainian. It's very hard. It's near impossible. So, um, yeah, I mean they do look at it as kind of in some ways kind of the way Serbs that look at Kosovo, like that they're that's part of like their story, their holy land. That's where they originate from, and then spread further north and so on. So it is vital for them.
Oh, absolutely, and it makes a lot of sense, especially with the Kosovo comparison. But I do want to move on to Venezuela. Believe it or not, we're still talking about Venezuela. So Russia has deployed 100 troops to Caracas. Now, Russia is the one of the first countries who actually backed Maduro, and they have had aircraft in the country since last year, since actually the showdown of the INF when Trump initially announced that he wanted to leave it. Russians moved some bombers into Venezuela. Now, there's many speculation as to why Russia deployed troops. Some say they're there to guard Maduro. Others say they're there to protect Russian interests as Russia buys up their natural resource as they get in on that good old Venezuela going out of business sale, getting up all their gold and stuff. And some say Russia may be there to help train Venezuelan forces in preparation for coming conflict. Now, if we're looking at this from a 4D chess angle, perhaps Russia is trying to prevent a regime change that would lead to a migrant crisis in the U.S. Yeah, looks like it sounds like Putin's looking out for us.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. American liberals, what WTF? I love Putin now. Here, I help you win 2020. Yeah, I don't. It's just too much. Yeah, my own take is that they could be doing all of the above, but I tend to think that they're training them. They're there to bolster moral support and to train them in case things get out of hand. I don't see a military conflict right now. I don't see that developing. America's going to have to create more sanctions, possibly get like various terrorist cells to start weakening their resolve. But I don't see it. And again, I wonder how good is this for Trump as we near 2020 on an election cycle. Like,
yeah,
his base is not going to be happy about this. I mean, they can talk all they want about we defeated communism again. Like, I mean, those are just absolute 80 IQ magapeds. But the truth is, the consequences of a victory there, I don't think they wanted.
Yeah, I was like just about to say, this all comes after Trump has really toned down rhetoric on Venezuela and pretty much forgotten the entire issue because it didn't stick. Nobody cared about it.
Yeah.
Now, moving on to something much more interesting, and something I actually caught me by surprise. After almost 75 years, Japan is moving to revive a fully fledged military force. Now, this has been speculated since 2012 that Abe, the current prime minister, wanted to revise or completely revoke Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Of course, for those who don't know, it was established after the war, saying Japan would never use their military in offensive sense ever again. That was only there to defend Japan and the homeland. But there's been shifts, and these moves were initially taken back in 2012 to counter North Korean aggression towards Japan, but have recently shifted to wanting to counter growing Chinese naval prowess. Now, Japan has plans to purchase 105 F-35 fighters. I feel bad for them. I hope they work. Probably not, but it's interesting. 2 multi-mission signal processors, 2 command and control process refreshers, radio navigation equipment, naval ordnance, 2 identification friend or foe systems, global command and control maritime hardware, 2 internal navigation systems. Let's see. engineering and logistics support services, installation support material, training, construction services for 6 vertical launch system module enclosures, communications equipment and other associated spares, classified and unclassified publications and software, and other related elements of logistical and program support. Now, Japan is also planning on developing medium and long-range cruise missiles. Japan's military strategy will be focused more on technological prowess as opposed to sheer numbers, like you would see in somewhere like China. Now, the U.S. will no doubt assist Japan in missile development, which I'm not even necessarily opposed to. One of my predictions, however, may be coming true because we may see a proxy arms race between the U.S. and Russia play out via China and Japan.
That's a good point. But I think, I mean, I see these changes. I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. There's going to be a segment of the Japanese population that are not going to be happy with this big way. However, it's going to go through. But what I think what I think will probably not go through is, getting into a conflict with China. And at the moment, I don't see a reason for why there would be a conflict with China. Like, America would have to bait Japan into it.
Oh, yeah.
Because so far, China, even with its island building, is still not technically infringing on Japan. And so there would have to be some kind of an infringement. I think it's basically like, honestly, it's a show of force. It's probably good business.
Yeah, China and Japan are just gonna shake their fists at each other, and unless things change drastically, I doubt China would risk going into Japanese waters.
Yeah, very much so. China has no need to go into Japanese waters. First of all, it's not important. So who are they supposed to intimidate? Northern Korea? Possibly. But Northern Korea, the fig leaf of Northern Korea is being a kind of demon of Northeast Asia, and is a rogue state and so on, and like that's just posturing. That's just a way they extort money out of South Korea.
Yeah. And
yes, I know they launched those missiles, but those missiles, I doubt very much were ever going to hit Japan. It's just an extortion. It's literally somebody with, a fake gun holding up a bank.
Yeah. Now, we did talk about this several times over. The fact that I guess you call it reunification of Korea, or at least the inner cooperation of Korea, is creating somewhat of, as I called it, a Mexican standoff in Asia. We're going to have China, Japan, and Korea all become 3 major powers. Now, what we could be seeing is, with the progress in Korea, Japan could be concerned that they may be facing a rival in the coming decades, so they want more military prowess to counter that. Not even just necessarily North Korean aggression, but like more so a unified, cooperative Korea. They may be afraid of that.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, Korea is the interest here, not China. China, it may involve China only because of China's location and China's historical ties with Korea. Especially during and after the Korean War. But of course, a unified Korea wedged between these two immense powers. I think you could even propose a scenario where China and Japan would cooperate in order to subvert Korea. Like, who's going to really ensure a country like Korea's its sovereignty?
Yeah,
who's really able to do that?
Yeah, especially if Korea keeps its nukes,
Yeah, there's just nobody there. I mean, and I don't foresee America making a last stand for Korea, and the Japanese have no interest in defending Koreans or Korean interests. So honestly, I think this is I see a lot of this as possibly a preparation for China expansion. But honestly, I think that's more theoretical at the moment. I don't know what the situation is going to be like in 50 years. So I think a lot of this is basically about the arms industry.
Yeah, probably. But I will say this: I'm actually in support of this move by the Japanese. It seems like a win-win scenario for America because, as we were saying, they're probably not too concerned about China's expansion, but this is definitely going to put China on its toes. So it's going to take less pressure off the U.S. having to put China on its toes. But I'm
Yeah.
also skeptical of foreign intervention in general. So it allows the Japanese to take a more active role in their own defense, and it allows the U.S. to cooperate with Japan both economically and militarily as an equal partner rather than us being the guarantor of their security. Now, rearmament in Japan, I doubt would lead to this, but ideally, it would necessitate less U.S. presence in that country.
Yeah, I agree with you in this, and I could definitely foresee America prioritizing the Philippines as a result, um, because of course China's route basically goes south and then west. It doesn't veer towards Japan. I see Japan's increased military as a kind of delineation, um, kind of creating a border in the water, so to speak, about what kind of wiggle room China has. And China's not, I mean, they're not a major naval power, so they're basically island hopping. This is basically for their trade that goes all the way across into Africa.
Yeah, that's pretty much China's end goal. They just want to create those, trade routes, and yeah, it's not like again, if it were, I would say, absent of any outside influence, a pure naval war between China and Japan, I think we know how that would turn out.
Yeah.
Um, But yeah, I'm just glad the Japanese are taking their fate in their own hands. It could be a loss of confidence in the U.S., but either way, again, it's less U.S. obligation to a foreign nation if the Japanese decide to rearm, which I think they should have done much sooner. I mean, pretty much everyone involved in World War II is dead at this point. Now, I will say this: while we're in Asia, I want to finish off the show with this. Now, there's been some interesting developments around North Korea. So on Friday, it was announced that Trump intended to lift sanctions on North Korea, which outraged the Washington establishment. Now, this is the Donald Trump I remember. This is the Trump I remember at the inauguration. This is the Trump I remember at the Korea summit. This is the Trump I remember, just even a few months ago. And it seems like, again, we've been discussing, Trump at least has control of his Asia policy. We can take solace in that fact. It's not much, but it's something. Now, this is the kind of move we need at this time, in my opinion. Over the past few months, the U.S. has shown itself to be hostile in general, and we need a gesture of goodwill to put the Koreans at ease if we're going to continue these negotiations. Now, no surprise, our good friend John Bolton came out and contradicted the president.
He's just, I mean, these guys, Bolton and Pompeo, are just awful. I don't even know what's the point of the good cop, bad cop routine at this point. The truth is, Kim is just going to lose interest in all of this. And they need him to maintain interest far more than he needs America to maintain interest. Because obviously, it doesn't. To me, it doesn't look like North Korea is on the verge of collapse. It doesn't look like this is a very desperate moment. To be honest, Venezuela looks like a country that's closer to that than North Korea. So I don't think anyone's being persuaded here.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree. And I think it goes back to the less relevant role of the U.S. in East Asia as opposed to Southeast Asia, as actually we were just discussing with the Japan issue, to the point where, yeah, our interests are probably going to shift to the Philippines, to Vietnam, to now some of the countries bordering Vietnam, maybe a Thailand or something. The several islands we control that we got from either the Spanish-American War or World War II. And again, I think it's kind of come to an understanding on both sides. Kim doesn't see the need as to do like Washington will be a lake of fire routine as he did in previous years. And the U.S., at least Trump, doesn't see the reason like why we still have an embargo, trade restrictions in North Korea. It's not that much of a problem. It seems like the situation has been diffused. The ball is rolling between the two Koreas, and our role is pretty much over. But of course, again, you get Bolton, Pompeo saying, "Oh, we need to be tough on tyranny or whatever tripe they pull out of their rear end this week."
Right, and I agree with you. I mean, depending on how trade talks go with China, I see it almost as an inevitability that the U.S. long term it needs to remove companies, needs to woo them over to other countries like Vietnam, Philippines, what have you. Of course, there are already companies there, but I mean, bigger tech companies. So, and that will, of course, create a situation within, in the South Asian area along the trade route that China is currently using. Yeah.
Yeah, but ultimately, again, it seems like a situation that's going on fine and well, but it seems like just Bolton just has to open his damn mouth, and I don't think it's going to completely derail it. I think, of course, it's going to be chaotic, as all things are, especially in this era. But again, it's frustrating, but it is good to see that Trump is actually making a move that makes sense after months of incoherent policy, both at home and abroad.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that.
But yeah, that's everything. We burned through that. We're over an hour, so I suppose this is a long show. I hope all our listeners enjoy this, and I hope some of the audio mishap at the beginning. I hope that pans out because I had some weird stuff with my tech thing. Yeah. These things are always weird. I think I had to update my OBS or something. But we will see you guys next week if the world is not consumed in nuclear fire, because you never know how these things are going to work out. We could be doing the stream from a bunker next week, but we see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Thanks for listening in, guys.